we talked about how we're very genetically similar and very genetically the same. We don't want to give that up, but we also do want to know, why is it that we look different from each other? And the answer to this is that it was relatively recent evolutionary adaptations when people spread into different areas of the world relatively recently. So let's talk about how recently. So we see Homo sapiens emerge in Africa around 300,000 years ago. In that range, maybe 200 to 300,000 years ago. We've pushed these dates back a little bit before what we used to think, but it was about 300,000 years ago that you see Homo sapiens emerge in Africa. And those Homo sapiens go into all parts of the world. And from about 50,000 years ago, you start seeing some of these regional phenotype variations emerge. The physical stuff changes. It doesn't necessarily mean there was a lot of genetic change, and we remained as one interbreeding species throughout this period. We still are, and we still will be. So, most of these variations are gradual, or what we call clinal. That is, if you take a walk from Asia to Europe, you're going to see a gradual change in features. Or if you took a walk north to south, east to west, north to south, etc., you're going to see these gradual changes. The other thing we know from our studies of microevolution is that these things combine independently. That is to say, you can mix up different traits. Those Punnett squares in Mendelian genetics is the traits don't all come as one big thing that you pass on. They pass on as these alleles, independent gene types that can combine and recombine. So, I'm saying all this in some ways to emphasize what we do not see when we look back or when we look at human variation today in comparison to what it was. We do not see deep genetic differences in the human population, stuff that would go back a million years or be deeply ingrained in these populations. We do not see rigid boundaries between groups so that all the people in Japan have one genetic combination and one trait, and they're the only ones that have it. And if you know that, you know, hey, you're from Japan. We don't see that. We see gradual variation within any area and between different areas. And we also don't see, in part because we know how Mendelian genetics works, and in part because people are always mixing and moving around in the past and today, we don't see packages of traits come together. Now, traits clump up in certain geographical areas, but if people move around, they can combine and recombine in different ways. So when we think about body types and skin color, or nose form and skin color, we don't see these tightly bound together as a genetic package. Now, oftentimes, when we approach anthropology, we think that when we study human evolution, that we're going to find those deep differences that have led to the groupings that we say we have today, various races. I want you to be able to explain why that is not the case, why we're not going to be looking back for some form of Neanderthal that might have evolved into such and such race. That's not how it works. All of the physical features and differences that we see today are pretty recent, and they emerge within one interbreeding species of Homo sapiens, and they don't have these very tight boundaries. So if we are talking about, for example, talking about skin color and body type, your textbook mentions certain rules that we have about body shape. We have here people from the Maasai in Kenya. If you're tall and lanky, you dissipate heat naturally. If you're up where you need to conserve heat, you might tend to get more stocky. This is well, I guess I would say it's partially an explanation for why we see different body types emerge in different parts of the world. But I don't want you to get too hung up on these as rules, because as your textbook says in the next sentence, that there's a spectrum of average body shapes seen among humans today that reflect many adaptations to specific regional climates. So people did adapt in certain ways, but when they say it's a rule, it's a guideline, I would say, for how things might progress under the conditions of stricter selection processes. In today's world, those selection processes have changed quite a bit. But for now, we'll just say that even in places that are cold and hot, you're going to see body variation within a certain population. So this is a rough guideline that in hotter climates, you might have more lanky body types, and in colder climates, you might have stockier body types. But I wouldn't get too hung up on it you're always going to see that. Now, a couple of you talked about skin reflectance. If you line all the people up in the world from darkest to lightest, it is a perfectly clinal or perfectly gradual distribution across all the known skin tones. And if you walk from one area of the world to another, and you look at the people who have lived longest in that region, this is what their skin reflectance. This is a little bit different than those trying to measure the color of a person's skin. So Liz told us you shine some ultraviolet light on it and see how much reflects back. This is what you get. What might account for the darker skin tones being concentrated in the tropics? Why might you want to have darker skin? It's better to have that sun radiation bounce off because it's hot. Sun is strong. And you see that in the Americas. You see it here. You see that also in the people who migrated in and populated the Americas. You also see those skin tone changes all throughout the Americas as well. Our most famous case is probably Africa, European differences, but you see it in India, you see it in Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, Australia, these areas of the world. You again see these kinds of slight differences. Now, why might it be a little bit perhaps more advantageous to be lighter skinned in the northern areas of the world? It helps with vitamin D absorption. Vitamin D turns out to be a pretty important vitamin. I didn't know how important it was. But if you're in a place where you're not getting much of it, then your children can suffer. It does have a reproductive disadvantage. It seems like in some of the northern areas, when people moved into those later on, they lost some of the melanin. Then we talk about sickle cell trait. This is another variation that has emerged. This is a trait that is also a consequence of natural selection, and it arises around areas where there is malaria. Sickle cell trait, it's one of those Punnett square things. If you have two recessive sickle cell traits, then it is very harmful to your health. You often can almost immediately die. You need very big health treatments to stay alive. It can be very painful. But if you are heterozygous for it, that is, if you have a recessive sickle cell but a dominant non-sickle cell, it can vary resistance to malaria. Malaria is a very deadly disease that arises around certain areas of irrigation and agriculture. This is a trait that seems to be related to natural selection in those areas. It is adaptive in a weird sense, because yes, if you are heterozygous for it in an area of malaria, that's good. However, even in those areas where it is adaptive, it can be harsh. It's a harsh way to adapt because you're losing up to a quarter of your kids just to adapt to malaria. It relates to something that I want to emphasize here is that when we talk about things like fitness and evolution and fitness, it is within an environment, and as that environment changes, the things that you might have been fit for are not fit anymore. And so when we see often in people who move from areas where there is sickle cell trait to other areas where there isn't, then it becomes a maladaptive trait instead of an adaptive one. Your textbook gives you a map that shows you where the HBS allele has arisen, causing the sickle cell trait. And you can see that it pretty closely corresponds to malaria distribution in these areas. The sickle cell trait is most concentrated in West Africa, a little bit here, and you can see that's also where you have some of the strongest malaria. Interestingly, though, it also arises here in Saudi Arabia, this area of the Middle East, where you have both malaria and some sickle cell trait. And also, people don't realize this, but in around Greece and Cyprus, you also have malaria, and in some Greek populations, there's a pretty high concentration of sickle cell trait because of that. Now, in the United States, people have typically associated sickle cell trait as a so-called race trait and something that you might have if you're Black. Why would we do that in the United States, considering that you might be Greek or Saudi Arabian or those kinds of things? Why have we seen sickle cell as a race trait? Where were most people dragged from Africa during the enslavement trade? Right in here, this area of West Africa is where most of the people were taken from to come to the Americas. Skin color distribution over here in East Africa is also very dark, but there's hardly any sickle cell trait. So we see this as a race trait just because of where people came from and who we see. But it is not, like other traits, it is not based on race. I want to go back to this skin color distribution idea. This is a different map where people tried to measure according to skin color variation. You can see that again, darker skin around the tropics, lighter skin in the top part. In the old days, if you walked along these lines, it would be a clinal distribution. I've put the year 1492 in there because this is what you would have seen if you were a traveler around the world in 1492. After 1492, people started to move more often transoceanically and started to get on boats and take people from boats into different places and put them there. It's not that people didn't move around, but under this regime of colonialism, when you're taking people from one part of the world and putting them together with people from other part of the world and putting them on plantations to work, as we talked about in the last class, those sugar plantations in the Caribbean and Brazil and plantations in the United States, or what would become the United States as well, this whole idea that there were these blocks of people and some people were white and some people were Black and some people were different kinds is what arose during the last 500 years. And in the United States, we don't really think about other forms of variation. For example, we usually don't talk that much about people from the South Asian subcontinent, people from India who also have varied skin from light to dark and a lot of things in between. We think about the sickle cell trait and we think of it as an African American trait when it is more widely distributed than that. It's the colonial system that emerged in these last years that put people into these blocks and put certain people into blocks and left other people out. So, for example, if you look at India, India is also a place that has sickle cell trait, and it's also a place that it concentrates around there where malaria is. But we don't usually talk about that because that's not part of the immigration patterns and the migration patterns that were established initially under colonialism. So India confirms our point here that malaria and skin tone are a basis of geography, not some fixed thing because of race, and that these traits are generally clinal or gradual. Traits do clump up in certain geographical areas, but they don't come as one package that we can then say, you are of the Indian race, therefore you have such and such a trait. All right. In the next part of the chapter, the textbook goes into some things that some people have begun to call the extended evolutionary synthesis. In the last class, we talked about the modern evolutionary synthesis, which was the unification of Darwin's ideas of selection, natural selection, with Mendel's ideas of genetics and inheritance, which happened after both of them died and people put their work together, and it underlies the modern synthesis in biology. In the next section, they talk about some things that have emerged more recently in biology. Some of these are still being debated and worked out, and they are seen as an add-on or an extension of the modern synthesis, but there are ways in which, especially human beings, participate in their own evolutionary processes and perhaps may need to be thought of differently in some ways than other creatures. So we're going to be talking about niche construction, coevolution, developmental plasticity, and a tiny bit about epigenetics. Our first example is going to be lactose tolerance. In the United States, we have all these advertisements that are like, drink milk. And you have those milk mustaches, and milk is good for you. The majority of the world is lactose intolerant. You wouldn't know it in this country because we have milk and cheese everywhere, but the majority of the world's population, about 70%, is lactose intolerant. Now, why did that happen? Lactose tolerance is something that came up relatively recently in human beings. It only emerged about maybe 7 to 10,000 years ago when people started herding animals and relying upon their milk. And in areas where people herded cows and other milk creatures, mostly cows, their adaptations got altered a bit. This is an example of what the biologists call niche construction, in that you are not simply adapting to an environment, you are changing that environment. You are altering that environment, and in doing so, you are altering the conditions of selection in the next generation. So if there's all this milk around, and that's your primary nutrition, there were mutations that developed that allowed people to keep drinking milk into adulthood. And those were advantageous in certain areas if that's most of your food. Now, this is also an example of what we call coevolution, where two different animals or creatures or a package of animals and creatures start to evolve together so that one transforms the other. In this case, people become dependent on their cows, but the cows also become dependent on their people, and they both start to evolve different traits that reflect that codependence. Now, like malaria and other traits, lactose tolerance or intolerance is not about skin color. There's a picture of a guy in Poland milking a cow, but there's also a person in Africa milking a cow. And in both of these areas where herding came around, people had more lactose tolerance. Now, if we look around the world, this is a map of Eurasia, you can see again that we have, let's see, yes, the least lactose tolerant area of the world is in East Asia. Some of the most lactose tolerance of the world are in here in East Africa, Northwest Africa, around in Saudi Arabia, and up here in Scandinavia and some of the northern climates. And that's probably why we have so many ads for milk, because both of the main populations that made up the United States came from areas of Europe and from West Africa who could drink milk. Now we have all these people who think milk is good for you. But in terms of the world, population, it's an outlier. It is an outlier. Only 30% of the world is lactose tolerant. But in certain areas of the world, it goes up to 80 or 90%. There's a big debate in my own family because I am from a lactose tolerant area of the world, Italian background. pure gorgonzola cheese and all that weird, smelly milk cheese stuff. My wife is from, her parents are from South Korea, one of the most lactose intolerant areas of the world, never had cheese in the fridge at all. The interesting thing is that it seems to be that even over 2 or 3 generations, our kids seem to be pretty lactose tolerant. So this can change even among Asian populations who move to lactose dominant regions. They can sometimes become more lactose tolerant, even if they don't mix up their genetics. Lactose tolerance, most of it seems to be genetic and a genetic modification that has been passed around because of people that were herding over the last 7,000 years. But it is also something that is part of another thing that is in the extended evolutionary synthesis, the notion of developmental plasticity. And that is that the area that you grow up in, the environment, can change the way you are phenotypically expressed. It may not change your genetics, but it may affect which genes turn on and off and how you'll respond to different environments. A great example of this is altitude, how far up you are. And spent a year in college in Quito, Ecuador, at around 9 or 10,000 feet. Now, when you go to 10,000 feet, quite higher than Denver, by the way, which is our example of the mile-high city, if I transport you to 10,000 feet tomorrow, what's going to happen to you? There are 3 adaptations to living in high altitude environments. For people who have lived in these environments for thousands of years in the Tibetan highlands, in the Andes, and different places, generation over generation, there are genetic changes which allow them to get more oxygen into their blood. So they develop larger, what they call barrel chests, and that's a genetic adaptation. But also, if you were born in this area, even if you were not genetically part of the area, as you grow up, as your body is developing, that's where the developmental plasticity comes in, your body naturally adapts to the thinner oxygen levels. But you can also have some developmental plasticity over time. So you may not want to go for a jog the first day that you get there, but after a month or so, you might be able to do more because your body starts to adapt to those changing conditions. So in different ways, we adapt to the environment we grow up with. Another interesting example of developmental plasticity is how people's heights have changed over the last, changed and not changed, maybe I should say, over the last 100 years. For some of you who may come from families who have immigrated, certainly in my own family, they didn't have very much to eat in Italy, and that's why they migrated out. My grandparents are very short. My father is taller than both of his parents because he had more nutrition growing up. The world's tallest people, at least in 2014, seem to be in the Netherlands, where they have popped up about 5 inches. The biggest height gain seems to have been, at least 10 years ago, is in Iran, where the men popped up about 7 inches there over the last 100 years. Why are these Dutch people so tall? Aren't they supposed to be stocky?
So short.
And why are, yeah, well, let's talk about that. Why are the Dutch so tall? Shouldn't they be fighting off the cold and developing stocky bodies? What are they doing shooting up like that? Being all tall, getting the tallest people. Could it be their diet? Could it be their diet, their great healthcare system, the fact that everybody has access to healthcare and a very highly developed economy? It could be, and that's what it seems to be. The Dutch make sure that everybody is fed, well nourished. Remember, we read about rest, regularity, and cleanliness. They are all about that, and there's their reward, being the tallest people. Obviously, there's something genetic to that. It's not completely that, but yes, in today's world, where they probably don't have to fight off the cold in their natural environment, they have become the tallest. And why are the Guatemalan women so short? Look at what happens with South Korea. South Korea and the Guatemalans in 1914 are pretty much the same in terms of their height. Yet the height gain for South Korean women is almost 8 inches, and the poor Guatemalan women have only gone up 3 inches. Now, I'm not going to say there's nothing genetic there, but is there anything else that might account for this difference? How do you go from being the same to being such a big difference?
Medicine?
Well, certainly the medicine, yeah, the healthcare system definitely helps, as we saw among the Dutch. And why might you have a different healthcare, better medicine in South Korea? Almost all of us have seen the K-pop Demon Hunters. We probably have an LG or a Samsung or drive a Kia or a Hyundai or something. I mean, South Korea has one of the biggest GDP per persons in the world. You can go there, and there's a lot of money in healthcare around, and their healthcare system is one of the most amazing. People fly from the United States to go over there and have a total body scan and have their whole stuff done in Korea. This has a lot to do with economic development and the different kinds of plasticity and how you also spread your resources around, how you're giving your healthcare out in the world. Because there's another aspect to plasticity. It can be a good thing if you grow up in a different environment, but it can also be if you have social stress on you, it can impact your phenotypes. If you grow up in an area where there's not as good a nutrition, or if your healthcare is compromised, if you don't have that much money in general and can't get access to the nicer things and have access to bad calories, you might say, it impacts your phenotype. The way in which we treat other people through our social institutions, like the healthcare system, like the education system, like the way in which food is distributed, also shapes how their bodies grow and how their lives are going to be led. If you're an indigenous person in Guatemala who has faced very harsh measures from the state and been persecuted, it's going to affect your health and the way your body turns out. Your textbook gives us the example of Dr. Robin Nelson, biological anthropologist doing field work here in Jamaica, where she looked at the different ways that biology and social stress impacted people who were put into family homes as compared with residential homes. So again, this is an example of how biology and culture can intertwine, or biology and social situation can intertwine. If people feel like they belong in a place, your body can respond positively and it can have different health outcomes. Now, I mentioned the idea of epigenetics, which is this one is still perhaps something that is more controversial or being worked out in the biological science, but it's the notion that your environment, especially the maternal environment, can have multi-generational changes. The coding of the genes will change based on what's going on in the environment. It's a little bit maybe cutting edge or hasn't been entirely worked out in biology, but it is an interesting idea and goes with some of our other lessons. Now, for the most part, or in this chapter, we have been talking about the physical adaptations that happened over the last 50,000 years, pretty recently, to make people have different phenotypes, to look differently, but without a whole lot of genetic modification. But I just want to make clear that let us say that you move to a place and you have a lanky body, but you're in a cold climate. What can you do? Crank up the heat. What if you find yourself being a stocky person in Florida? Turn on the air conditioning and chill out. You don't have to worry so much about any genetic adaptation. What should you do if you find yourself being a light-skinned person in the tropics and your skin reflectance isn't the right tone for where you have so much sun exposure? Put on some sunscreen. Everybody should probably be wearing sunscreen. Conversely, we're finding out what should you do if you're not absorbing enough vitamin D from the sun. Take some vitamin D pills. It turns out most people in the United States, no matter how light their skin, are vitamin D deprived, have a vitamin D deficiency. So ask your doctor about this, but a lot of people need to take vitamin D and wear sunscreen. So in today's world, we have these different things which allow us to adapt in different ways to the heat, the cold, the sun, the lack of vitamin D, etc. So you don't have to worry about that you're in the wrong climate. If you are lactose intolerant, what can you do today before you eat the gorgonzola cheese? If you want to eat it, you really would like to have some cold cheese pizza tonight, but you're lactose intolerant and you're worried, what should you do? You can take a pill. You can take a lactase pill and go ahead and enjoy that cold cheese pizza. Or you can buy lactate milk and guzzle it down. And there you go. You have all these products which allow you to be lactose tolerant. In today's world, human beings have expanded their role in constructing a world and niche construction. So we talked about how the herders, for example, made it more appealing to be able to drink milk and to tolerate milk in certain environments. And people used to change their localized environment and change it around so it would change the conditions of selection in the next generation. Maybe when you were building igloos in a cold climate, it might help to have been a stocky person to get into that igloo. But in today's world, we build these other things. We build big houses, crank up the heat, crank up the AC. When we do crank up the heat and crank up the AC, drive around all the time and keep ourselves enclosed in cars, what does that do every time I'm blasting the AC in the summer? What happens? Getting hotter. So I keep turning up my air conditioning.
You're not acclimating to what's going on outside.
Yeah, I'm not acclimating. I don't want to. I want it to be nice and cool in my house. So I just turn up the dial and cool it off. What does that do? I'm blasting energy into the world. When I cool down my house, it means something else has to heat up more because I'm using electricity or I'm using, for hopefully we're able to do the solar panels and things like that, but most of our energy use comes from gas, which, as you may know, has a role in climate change. What are we doing? We are changing the whole world. We're in a process. Human beings are altering niche construction wise the environment for everybody. We'll see how it works out. Now, this doesn't mean that evolution has stopped. Evolution continues because evolution doesn't have a direction. It's not that just because people can take lactose pills or put on sunscreen that evolution has stopped. It just changes in different ways. I heard about in the last class, people might be losing their wisdom teeth. That's a form of evolution. It's neither good nor bad. It might be because of niche construction, because it's easy to chew the things that we have to eat. You don't need those wisdom teeth anymore to gnaw on things like you used to. So it doesn't help you. Evolves away. Again, it's neither good nor bad. It might be adaptive or maladaptive. There might not even be a natural selection reason. It's not useful anymore, so it's going away. But the point of the matter is our evolution here is very complex and we impacted ourselves in different ways. All right. So, summarizing, human variation is rich and complex. Some of you said at the beginning, and I cannot emphasize this enough, we are genetically very similar, over 99% similar. Yet, let's not underplay the fact that we look different. We're phenotypically diverse. We don't all look the same. Where do those phenotypical diversity things come from. They come from recent evolutionary adaptations, from the ways in which people have transformed their environments and other things, niche construction, and they come from plasticity, or the fact that as we grow up in different environments, we might be different heights, weights. Your environment can change your conditions of development. All of these variations are important to understand. Sickle cell trait, for example, is a huge biological variation that can be adaptive and maladaptive. But as I've been talking about, all of these adaptations, when you put them together, are much more complex than our notions that people are black or white or Asian or 7 different races and all those races have certain traits. Now, the complexity of human variation spans all of those, and there is always much more variation within any of those categories than there is between any of those categories. Our notions of biological race, which come to us from the colonial period when people started moving around and dragging other people in different parts of the world on boats, are not adequate to describe the biological variation of the world. They never were and they aren't today. However, that doesn't mean that people who experience racism because of these categories, that also can have biological effects. So biologically, race doesn't make much sense, but people who are on the underside of racism, so to speak, might not get the best health care, might not get the best nutrition, might have social stigma attached to them. That has a biological effect. Now, this can change. We can, because we are a plastic species. If we start reforming our institutions and changing the way we act toward one another, we can improve the outcomes for mothers, children, people in general. But we have to realize that our social system can have these biological effects. Reversible, true, they can give us hope, but we don't want to downplay that those effects have been real over time.